Winter, 1620. The coastal winds are howling and the ocean currents raging. At first glance, the land appears deserted, although native inhabitants have already lived here for generations. They called it Patuxet. We now know it as Plymouth. Suddenly, through the misty gale, a battered wooden ship with just over 100 people glides into view. The exhausted crew and passengers anxiously scan the shoreline. The waters are teeming with fish, the woods full of game. But where are the people? There is evidence of a settlement, but the inhabitants are gone.
A great loss, a great loss of population. Estimates range anywhere from 75% to 95% of the population was wiped out.
There were unburied people, skeletons, here in Patuxet.
All those people that were just dying by tens of thousands.
Great Dying was really an astronomical loss for the indigenous people in New England. I mean, in some places you have numbers as high as 90% of the population being killed by this illness.
The incredible death toll was caused by a mysterious plague, a pre-colonial sickness raging among indigenous people unprepared for the horror they faced. Quite simply, most of those who once lived on this coast, the vast majority, had died.
On this site here, which was Patuxet, there were about 2,000 people who lived here before in 1616. There were 0 people who lived here in 1620 when the Mayflower showed up. This doesn't mean every single person died. Probably there were survivors who moved to join other villages further inland, but you can get the idea that the communities were decimated by this plague.
For the Wampanoag and for the people that were indigenous of this region 400 years ago, it didn't care. Those people had absolutely no immunities. They had no idea what was happening to them.
The Pilgrims on board the Mayflower had their own problems, many of them close to death already, from a combination of starvation, exposure, and the ill effects of weeks at sea. But they would not be prepared for what they discovered when they stepped on shore.
They would find structures that had been houses that people had lived in that were left abandoned, or fields that clearly had been tended at one point and were overgrown.
This is a story of death on a massive scale. But it's also a tale of survival, then and now.
All right. Hey, Paula, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. All right, I'm going to have you have a seat. We'll get a set of vital signs on you and we'll get moving.
All right, awesome.
400 years later, history is repeating itself for Paula Peters and her fellow members of the Wampanoag tribe. Her ancestors lived at Patuxet, and their settlement was perhaps hardest hit by that 1600s plague. And now, like the rest of us, they deal with COVID, and the historical echoes are painful.
Here we are 400 years later, and we're being confronted with this illness that there's no known source or cure for, or treatments are just falling short, people are dying. It was very much reminiscent of what I'd read about in history that had happened to our people 400 years ago.
So what happened in those years right before 1620? What was this plague? And where did it come from? And how would it change the world? Centuries later, what lessons are remembered by Native Americans? And how is it different this time for all of us? What would come to be known as New England was home to an extremely large indigenous community, from coastal regions, inland, to the forests and mountains. A population about to be devastated beyond belief.